Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us today for this program. I'm Mike Sfraga. I'm the director of the Polar Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today. As always, I want to thank the leadership of Laguna Corporation and A2A Railway for their support. We simply could not do our work without them, and we thank them each and every time we have our programs. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Woodrow Wilson Center and General Church Key, I welcome you to the first Arctic Security Dialogues, a shared series with the Arctic Domain Awareness Center. Today's program is entitled United States Air Force Arctic Strategy, Perspectives, and Insights. These dialogues, crafted and led by our two organizations, are a reflection of the new global security dynamics and related activities unfolding in the Arctic region. Therefore, the series is our attempt to provide context, insight, policy considerations to these important matters as we navigate together this new Arctic. Today's event builds upon Secretary of the Air Force Barbara Barrett's July 21st release of the department's Arctic strategy. That program was supported by our colleagues at the Atlantic Council. In her remarks, Senator Barrett noted, and I quote, "The Arctic is among the most strategically significant region of the world today." And according to a follow-up press release, quote, "The strategy outlines the department's unique regional role and efforts to optimize air and space capabilities throughout the region in support of the national defense strategy." And as a reminder, the Arctic strategy of the Air Force outlines 4 lines of effort: vigilance in all domains, projecting power through combat credible force, cooperation with allies and partners, cooperation for Arctic operations. So today's events builds upon the Secretary's release of the Arctic strategy and a virtual discussion the Polar Institute held last month with Senator Lisa Murkowski and Senator Dan Sullivan. And although today's event focuses on the Air Force's strategy and related matters, these Arctic security dialogues between the Wilson Center and the Arctic Domain Awareness Center are designed to cover a broad range of security issues, to include many issues related to the civil security dimensions of the region. As we know, in the Arctic, there's a shared tyranny of distance, requiring preparedness, robust assets and training, and domain awareness, as well as a fundamental need for broad-based cooperation. Our series will explore these issues as well. But today, we build on the foundational discussions I've already mentioned, and we will do so with a distinguished group of military leaders, each bringing to the discussion what I call an arc of experience and perspectives, from leadership roles in Alaska to NATO. We thank them for taking the time to be with us today and for their willingness to provide their insights and perspectives. So, to start today's discussion, it's a pleasure to turn over the program to my colleague, friend, and partner in this endeavor, General Randy Church Key, Major General, United States Air Force, retired, Executive Director of the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, and a Global Fellow at the Polar Institute. Church, I turn over the program to you.
Good morning, Mike, and thank you. And Generals, we're just grateful, we're truly grateful for this gift of your time to spend time with us today and really informing this remarkable audience that is assembled to listen to hear your reflections of how the Air Force, the Department of the Air Force's Arctic strategy, some aspects to consider that may be helpful as the Air Force continues to work towards implementation of its recently released Arctic strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, patriots all, it is a privilege to join with Dr. Sfraga and the Woodrow Wilson Center Polar Institute in this Arctic Security Dialogue series. Today's event is the first of what we look to see over the coming months as a series of deep dives by gathering subject matter experts who understand the region, the perspective, and bring to their experiences to the table in a way that hopefully is helpful for the department's organization that we seek to try to help inform through these dialogues. Today's discussion is building on the Department of the Air Force's recently released Arctic strategy from the 21st of July this year. We have distinguished leaders who each of them have Arctic experience, who have the benefit of time of Arctic experience in uniform and really that looking back now from that perspective and what they've learned since that time in uniform that hopefully may be helpful for those who are listening and learning to look at ways to capitalize on their reflections, their experiences in ways as they look towards, in the Department of the Air Force's context, an implementation effort for this recently released strategy. And to highlight this example today, we have the following distinguished leaders that are joining us. First of all, General Joseph W. Ralston, who is the former commander of the United States European Command, as well as the former commander of Supreme Allied Command Europe, 4-star retired. Joining him also is another SACEUR, General Philip M. Breedlove, former commander of Supreme Allied Command Europe and also United States European Command. Joining him was today as well as General Douglas M. Fraser, the commander of United States Southern Command. Also joining us is General Carol callsign Howie Chandler, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, retired. Joining him as well, of course, is General Patrick K. Gamble, Commander of Pacific Air Forces, retired. An opening set of reflections today are provided by Lieutenant General David A. Crum, the Commander of Alaska Command, United States Northern Command, 11th Air Force, and Commander North American Aerospace Defense Command, here at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting from here in Eagle River, Alaska. As Mike said in this reflection here, the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force, jointly under the Department of the Air Force, recently released this Arctic strategy with the 4 lines of effort that Mike has highlighted. What we're hoping to see from today's discussion is these general officers with their experience in both with 2 former SACEURs, Supreme Allied Commanders for Europe, bringing a European Arctic perspective to bear. And then 4 of these 5 general officers are prior Alaska Command, 11th Air Force, and Alaska NORAD region commanders. So each of these general officers has an insight on the Arctic from their time in uniform, and they've had a chance to reflect on that, those experiences departing after they departed their service and retired from the United States Air Force, reflecting those aspects to bear in what we hope today is a robust discussion of insights, perspectives, and lessons that they have learned and wish to share, and helping the Air Force think through, the Department of the Air Force think through implementing this Arctic strategy. One thing this conversation is not intended to be necessarily a critique of this Department of the Air Force. The strategy is really trying to help the Air Force think through aspects of implementation, aspects of things that they should consider and capitalizing on those 4 lines of efforts and envisions all domains, projecting power through a combat credible force, cooperation with allies and partners, and preparation for Arctic operations. This has both elements to the Air Force and the Space Force. So we'd like to give this as a tee up. We are looking forward to people getting chats that'll filter over to us to queue up to these general officers after their initial reflections. But before we go into the distinguished panel of retired general officer leaders, we'd like to showcase the conversation. First of all, we're not going to be doing lengthy bios on any of these general officers. They're all highly searchable, and you can read every detail they have of their time in uniform and their time beyond. But we'd like to give an opening set of reflections to the general who has the watch now. And this is the Commander, 11th Air Force, Alaska NORAD region, and Alaska Command, Lieutenant General David A. Crum, and United States Air Force. General Crum, I'd like to give you the floor for your reflections as we tee up this conversation. General, you've got the floor, sir.
Hey, thanks, Church. And Mike, not only for inviting me, but for actually hosting this event. And it is an important and critical time. Thanks to the Arctic Security Dialogue that we're having here, it's becoming foremost on our minds that we've got to do something different up here. Wilson Center and ADAC, we're just very, very thankful for you guys and what you do and raising the awareness on this topic. Now, I do have to admit that my precarious location on the schedule is not very good, because I've got some of the most sage, wise, influential, impactful individuals there are on this subject that follows me. So I'm kind of like that unknown warm-up band for Queen or Journey or the Eagles. Everyone's waiting for the true rock stars to perform, and so I'll do my best to set the stage as we go forward so we can listen to all those burning bushes speak about what they know with this. You know, the release of a service-specific strategy is really just an acknowledgement of the increasing importance of the Arctic, and in particular Alaska. Alaska has always been important. Geography matters. General Billy Mitchell opined that Alaska's location makes it the most strategic place on Earth, and geography isn't changing. But I also think that the Air Force strategy is an acknowledgement that the Arctic is also very, very complex. And as your designated scene center, what I submit to you, while the geographical location hasn't changed, there are many key dynamics in the Arctic that are. It's a demanding physical environment that's changing rapidly. There's a global demand for the natural resources located in the Arctic, made available by some of those changes. There's increasing military and commercial presence and activities. And there's other technological capabilities that could allow others to use the Arctic as an approach to North America rather as a barrier. And I'll briefly speak to each one of those as we go forward. There's no doubt that the Arctic remains a tough place to operate in. The extreme cold hasn't changed in the winter, and neither have the winds and waves over vast distances. It's all complicated by communication challenges, both from the distance and also the atmospheric interference. But the physical changes to the Arctic, they're dramatic and they're increasing. The Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the globe, and it's creating more navigable waters that allow access to those coveted resources of gas, oil, minerals, and protein. But it's also creating problems for us along the coast. And with coastal erosion, as well as the permafrost melting, that's creating huge complexities for our infrastructure, as well as some of our native populations up here in Alaska. Now, the environment is still challenging. The access to those, what I would call in great demand resources, is attracting attention. There are multiple competing geographical claims by numerous Arctic countries, which stretch the definition of things like continental shelf. Most are generally following international law. We are seeing a challenge to the rules-based order. Russia, with the way it regulates maritime operations in the Northern Sea route, and it's not limited to actual Arctic nations. China has declared itself a near Arctic nation, which, if you have studied geography or you have access to Google Maps, might perplex you greatly. But we see them attempting to gain a role in the Arctic. And we've seen in other areas of the world how they ignore international norms and rules. And there's a risk that their predatory economic behavior may be repeated here in the Arctic. That access to those resources is creating increasing commercial and military activity. I'll remind you that about 10% of Russia's GDP and about 20% of their exports actually come from the Arctic. And its commercial investments in the Arctic have been matched by their continued defense investments and activities that strengthen both its territorial defense and its ability to control the Northern Sea route. But it also gives them a capability to control beyond that. They're creating new Arctic military units, refurbishing old airfields and infrastructure, and actually establishing new bases along the Arctic coastline. And here's why that's important. Moving someone who's already established themselves is extremely difficult. We've seen that in areas like Crimea, as well as the East China Sea. And we want to make sure that that pattern doesn't repeat itself in the Arctic. The other key dynamic that's been changing the Arctic is technology. It's changing the scene. The Arctic's capacity as a strategic buffer is eroding. It's making it an avenue of approach to the homeland due to advancements by our great power competitors like Russia and China. For as long as North America has existed, the US and Canada have been protected by two great oceans and this formidable environment to the north. But our adversaries' capability to directly attack our homeland has leapt forward, and they continue to advance capabilities with nuclear, conventional, and cyberspace weapons. Those are kind of the few dynamics in the scene that I wanted to set for you. But I would say that the recent released Air Force strategy goes a long way to addressing some of those challenges. But it also addresses the Arctic as an area of strategic opportunity. The four main lines of effort that Church and Mike so eloquently described to you, vigilance in all domains, first line of effort for me, what that means is constant awareness. Sensors that can detect and track under and on the water as well as in air and space. And it means be able to communicate control using things like Joint All-Domain Command Control, or as we are affectionate for our acronyms, JADC2. Power projection of a combat credible force is a line of effort well underway by the Air Force with F-35s, joining the F-22s up here in Alaska, paired with airborne surveillance aircraft, airlift, as well as tankers. I would say that cooperation with our allies and partners is probably our most important line of effort. Of the 8 Arctic nations, the U.S. is an ally of 4 of them and partners with 2 of them. The vastness and complexities of the Arctic, it necessitates that we work together. And we've got to cooperate and synergize our efforts. And make no mistake, we fly, fight, and win with all of those 6 other friends. But partners includes non-traditional ones as well. partners like our Alaska Native tribes, who are the people that know this region best. And no one's got more knowledge to provide than those who've been here since time began. The final line of effort is one I'm focused on, and I think it's the key for the strategy, because we have to prepare for the Arctic operations. We have to prepare to train. We have to prepare to sustain, persist, and thrive, not survive, in the Arctic operations. So how do we do this? We have to begin investing in the foundation for operations, infrastructure, equipment, locations, training, search and rescue, and other things that are critical for us to be able to employ. I will tell you that my approach to the Arctic and Alaska in particular is not limited to Air Force strategy. It's informed by DOD's and the other services strategy, as well as all of the government. It's got to be a whole of government approach here. No one service or branch can do it by its own. I think we're at a pivotal point on the timeline of the Arctic. And while I've described those challenges and those dynamics and the scenes that are, and there are areas of potential dispute, I think there are also areas that we can cooperate in. All 8 Arctic nations can pursue innovative partnerships to develop needed capabilities and capacity over time. We can work together in enforcement of international law and norms. And I think there's great promise in synchronizing our efforts in a coordinated search and rescue arrangement, all the while knowing that our desired end state for the Arctic is a secure, it's a stable region where the interests of the United States and our allies are safeguarded, the homeland is protected, and the nations address shared challenges cooperatively, and we benefit from the opportunities together. I would think, in my personal opinion, that America's economic, environmental, and security interests will become even more closely tied to the Arctic in the future. And I think it's exactly the right time to work on it together. And I welcome to hear the sage advice of my elders as they talk today. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing the discussion.
General Crum, thank you very much. That's a heck of a warm-up answer. Thank you for giving those reflections. You've outlined the concerns and really the contours of the challenges you face. I really appreciate the aspects of how much you highlighted these different facets and how they impact you directly as the Commander, Alaska Command 11th Air Force, Alaska NORAD region. We hope that now to queue up the conversations for you and your staff, and hopefully you'll find some great insights from these reflections. Let me give the floor now back to my good friend, Dr. Shrega. Mike, sir, please introduce our first of these distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Church, and thank you, General Crum. As Church pointed out, the contours, which I wrote down on my notepad, are exactly right. I think you've done a very wonderful job of outlining those contours, but also the content and sort of the terrain within those contours of the Arctic. It's, from your comments, absolutely a dynamic region. We have a globalized Arctic now, and to hear your comments put into perspective from Alaska, from the Arctic, and a global perspective are incredibly helpful. So a wonderful transition now to General Ralston for his perspectives and his insights, not only on what General Crum has just mentioned, but also from your time serving in the North, but also thinking about our forces and our force structure and the global dynamics writ large from your career as well, sir. So I turn the floor over to you, General Ralston. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to applaud the Air Force for publishing this strategy. I think it's very good. I think it's organized very well, as people have talked about, with the 4 areas, and I'll provide a couple of comments on each one of those. I think the real question I've got, or the real issue that I've got, is it's one thing to publish a strategy, but now the resources have got to follow. And if you don't have the resources, then you're not going to be able to implement that strategy. With regard to vigilance, again, I think the Air Force has stepped up to that. I think the long-range discrimination radar upgrade at Clear Air Force Station is certainly a step in the right direction for that. As General Crum talked about, there are still issues that need to be sorted out, and in particular, communications. How do you do that? How do you make sure that he can get the radar data from the North Warning System back to his command post so that he can make the right decisions with regard to the NORAD mission? Do you need a redundant path over what we've got today? I don't have the solution to that, but I think it's something that the Air Force needs to look at. Do you have a combination of satellite as well as terrestrial? That needs to be worked on and needs to be funded to do that. Power projection. Every former ALCOM commander, as well as General Crum, has put very high on our list the mission of educating our colleagues in Washington and in the Pentagon on the geography and to get them to quit looking at a Mercator projection and look at a polar projection. And the fact that the Air Force has put F-22s and F-35s in Alaska is certainly a great step in the right direction. But to follow up on that little geography lesson, if we ask if we ask our colleagues in the Pentagon that are involved in strategic planning, who's closer to Beijing, Hawaii or Alaska, 95% of them would say Hawaii. Well, I might remind the audience here today that we can operate F-22s out of a base in Alaska that's 2,000 miles closer to Beijing than Hawaii is, 2,000 miles. If you look at going to the Arabian Gulf, the F-22s here at Elmendorf can be in the Arabian Gulf 2 hours before the same F-22s out of Langley Air Force Base can be there. The F-35s at Eielson are 1,100 miles closer to Estonia than the combat-coated F-35s in the lower 48. So if you have a few high-value assets like the F-22 or the F-35, you're far better off to have them in a place like Alaska where they can go east or west as the requirement dictates. The C-17 for strategic airlift, and there's a sentence in the strategy that says the Air Force will provide strategic airlift and critical refueling to U.S. and partner aircraft. The C-17 being here, that's a step in the right direction. I might add that I think the tanker force needs to be upgraded, needs to be modernized. And as the Air Force goes through making decisions of where do they put KC-46s, I think they really need to look at Alaska for that. As we go into alliances and partnerships, obviously I've got a bias here, but as had been mentioned, out of the 8 Arctic nations, 5 of them are in NATO, and the other 2, Sweden and Finland, are close partners of NATO. And then you have Russia. I would encourage the Air Force, and I know this is a bigger US strategic problem, but if we go back to 1993, Alaskan Command led the first exercise to Russia since before World War II. And it was a search and rescue exercise. It was non-threatening to anyone, but we packed up the helicopters here in Alaska, the C-130 refueling airplanes, C-5s, and we took off to Siberia. Followed the next year in 1994, the Russians came to Alaskadians. In 1995, Canada hosted the exercise, and that exercise went on in excess of 10 years. And it was a way that we could talk to our Russian colleagues in a non-threatening way. It was something that was very useful, and I would certainly encourage the Air Force to look and see if there's a way that we could somehow reinstitute that exercise as we go forward. Preparation, I can't say it any better than what General Crum said before, but I encourage whatever we can do to improve the infrastructure and the training opportunities that we have here. That's all I have, Mike. Thank you.
General, thank you very, very much. The geography matters theme has come up a couple of times. I love the idea of the polar projection versus the Mercator. The content of your comments will come back to, especially this idea of some kind of cooperation between the U.S., Russia, and maybe NATO allies as well. And having the lessons learned from a couple of decades ago is helpful in thinking about the future and the needs of the Arctic, and to keep the temperature low in the Arctic as much as possible. So thank you very much. Church, back over to you. And as just a note for the audience, we are taking notes. I am watching the questions coming in, and we will loop those in appropriately after each of the generals has had time to speak.
Thank you very much, Mike. And General Olson, thank you for those reflections. I'm going to wear the pencil lead on my pencil pretty quick by catching these notes. Let me just offer the floor now to former PACAF commander and also former University of Alaska president, General Gamble. Sir, I'd like to respectfully give you the floor for your reflections.
Thanks, Church, and thank you also, Mike. It's been really enjoyable getting back to the business of crunching this sort of a problem, kind of like we used to do when we were on active duty and presented with similar situations. Nowadays, when you get a bunch of old guys like us together, we would normally fall into telling a whole bunch of war stories. I prefer this morning to call that history instead of war stories. And what I'd like to do is focus some of that history on line item number 4 in the strategy preparation, because I think to a large degree it renders moot at least 2 of the other items in the strategy. And then the vehicle that I've chosen to use is to talk about lessons learned. And I would like to go back about 40 years ago. Most of the people around who were involved in that to any great degree as analysts are probably long gone. And they don't remember what it took when we started the shift from a European look with a little bit of Korea thrown in, but mostly Europe, because we were still deep in the Cold War. And we began to notice stuff starting to happen in the Middle East. And slowly but surely heads began to turn. I was in an organization called Checkmate at the time, when the chairman came down and he walked in and sat down and said, guys, he said, I need to know what I can do right now, today, not 5 years, not with new hardware, not 10 years, but today. He did that in Europe, and we had a very complex briefing. He did the same thing for the Middle East. So we all became Middle East analysts, about a dozen of us. We didn't hawk hardware, we weren't attached to a budget. All we did was take an operational look at what the warfighting capability or the ability to present ourselves in the Middle East under different contingencies. Very much like we're talking about the ability of our national defense system to be able to react to a number of different contingencies that we're probably all familiar with that can happen in the Arctic and will happen in the Arctic in the future if the sea lanes open up, for example. In the Middle East, starting in 1974, there was a Middle East war. Fuel from the Arabian Gulf became a big issue. 1979 was a really hot year. The hostages, Ayatollah came out of France, Iran falls, the Mujahideen were controlling about 80% of Afghanistan by that time. The rescue failed for the hostages, and all of a sudden we had a real focus on the Middle East. The president turned to the Secretary of Defense, and I characterized this a little bit, but it was sort of the way it happened. And he said, hey, whatever happened to that rapid reaction force I asked you to put together of about 100,000 men? And the SecDef said, I'll get right back to you on that. And the planners had been pushing some ideas around, but we were a totally different force back in 1979 in terms of jointness, for example. The RDJTF was declared ready to go, became the RDF for short. And they held their first exercise with the Marine exercise commander, corps commander, and obviously the usual suspects like 18th Airborne Corps, 82nd Airborne, 101st, and then some heavier units were all thrown in there, as well as pieces of wings, fighters, and then what was considered to be their best guess at what support would look like. The exercise was conducted at the National Training Center. It was a command post exercise followed or coincident with a field training exercise. First ever looking at a Middle East scenario, and of course it was done in a desert environment. The outcome was miserable. I mean, it was a terrible exercise. And what it did was it pointed out exactly what the analysis going in had suggested. We don't have jointness. I mean, we were arguing over things like who was going to command what. Communications, we couldn't talk to each other. Coordination was bad. The idea of being able to move munitions from one place to another as the Air Force wanted to project power, it could get the airplanes there fine, but all the rest of the stuff needed to come with it. And everybody was screaming for airlift. Rivals, bed downs, command authority, all those things did not pass very well in the exercise. So serious questions were raised. What is the readiness? What is the deployability? What is the right bed down? How do we sustain ourselves at scale? Not small exercises with a battalion for 5-7 days or a week, but I'm talking about scale. And by scale, we're talking about the operational level of war. We're talking about corps for the Army. We're talking about multiple wings for the Air Force. Reliability. When we get into an environment like the desert, how does the equipment work? We were in the NTC running around, and yeah, we fixed tanks and we fixed some airplanes over there, but the infrastructure was totally different than what we were finding. And then maintainability. We had a lot of equipment that just simply wasn't very maintainable. It was really hard to dig in and fix things because they weren't designed necessarily to be fixed on the road. They were designed to work at a main base. The Secretary of Defense in 1982 said the 82 to 86 defense plan is going to focus on Southwest Asia, and he put $17.4 billion in to start the process seriously. I want to fast forward. The RDF became CENTCOM. Desert Ops began, and Saddam Hussein helped us along because as the Iran-Iraq War ended, about 1988, 89, first part 89, the new players began to stand up, and we were by that time very cognizant of what needed to be done in the desert on the surface. But responding to the desert was the first time we began to really deploy like we used to do to Europe. We used to run to Europe and back and forth, and everybody could do that in their sleep practically. But we began Desert Ops. It took 10 years, but in 1990, we were at the absolute top of our game when the first Iraq War kicked off. And it was because we actually went in and not simulated, not tabletop, but we actually went in and did it and tried to move units in at scale. And we worked through the problems over all those years. We had budgets that supported the requests for resources. And as a result, there was a continuity buildup for the desert that probably was what the war colleges would say the gold standard. One comment I thought that was interesting, capabilities validated by limiting simulation. It can't be abstract, and it has to be valid at a certain level under operational conditions. And that's scale, and that's the operational scale at the max. Now, as we shift to the Arctic, we've got a brand new theater here, and it's all mostly right now looking at a number of ways in which we work together. There are a number of scenarios where there is not a military angle to them at all. But if you go to the higher end, when you start looking at the EEZ, when you start looking at the 200-mile limit and what's allowed inside a 200-mile limit, and you start thinking about who owns what, at some point, it is conceivable it could result in security issues. And if it does, then much like the chairman said way back when, what can I do today? And that's the problem that we face. And today it's not the desert. Today we have an entirely different environment in which, if you read the Army manuals, they will say, for example, water is the single biggest issue to be faced in the Arctic for Army operations. And I got to looking at that and digging down into it, and the Army's done an amazing amount of research, looking at how many calories are burned by soldiers who are working in snow or working on skis. What can they eat? How do they digest and handle certain kinds of foods? Well, it turns out all this stuff is totally different than what we're used to. You can't put a camelback on a soldier and marching through 40 degrees below zero. If you put sustained troops in one position for a long period of time, we don't know what that's going to be like because our exercises have been so short. And we've always had the ability to go right back to the main base and kind of get fixed again. Sustainability is going to be huge. What should a footprint look like? It's 2,000 miles. as Joe said, from Anchorage to the North Pole. If you are having to go up there with any sized organization, say for a major rescue from an ocean liner, with casualties, search and rescue going on, and you had to provide a steady stream of support back and forth to a rather large sized unit made up of a whole bunch of support people, then it's the tempo that you have to build over that 2,000 miles, depending on where it happens, that's important. It's not whether an airplane can be refueled and make it there and back. It's can everybody make it there and back under a tempo that meets the mission requirements. That has not been exercised or practiced. In fact, it probably hasn't been even tabletopped very well. And so that's what happens when you pull that string and start getting into the issue. JP4 gets gelled at 20 below zero. In the Arctic, they use an Arctic fuel, for example. Bulk fuel in a large operation to the Arctic, because we don't have runways up there, and I'm not sure if a 900,000 pound loaded C5 can land on whatever needs to be landed on. I mean, we don't know those things. We need engineers to tell us where and what we can do. Those are the issues that are going to pop up. An infantry brigade combat team is about 4,500 guys and gals, and all the support that goes with them. Take away the artillery and take away that kind of stuff. Just look at getting them up there for whatever reason. Show of force, for example. Excuse me. A C5 is basically built to carry 75 people and a whole lot of freight. What kind of airplanes are going to go up there? How many sorties is it going to take? Where's the fuel going to come from to get home? How are you going to store fuel? These are issues that are the real sustainability issues that we're going to have to tease out. Human waste. Can you imagine for a sustained period of time up there? What do you do with junk and human waste? There's an international reaction that's going to occur once people begin to see what that might look like under a contingency that would just be one of those side effects we're going to have to deal with. We worked all that kind of stuff out in the desert. Excuse me, guys. We worked all that out in the desert. It took 10 years. That's a huge lead time, but logistics in the Arctic can't be a pickup game. And the only way you know what you don't know is to go do it, is to actually rehearse, not simulate, but rehearse. Can we do that? We've got 1 million acres, 60,000 square miles of airspace. We got a bridge across the river with a little bit more rail. We can go in Alaska and do large scale operational level rehearsals. We can bring the battle group up. We've done that before. We can look at how a joint team would support any number of scenarios in the Arctic with a totally different look than we've ever looked before. How would we do that? Tabletop it, exercise it, and then go out and do it and build up to the capability to know we're comfortable. The final thing I'll say is, it's interesting to watch the Russians. The troops they have and the bases they have in the Arctic are there full time. These people live and work full time in the Arctic because they found out that you can't build an Arctic support scheme for large numbers of support vehicles, airplanes, people. You can't build that and then walk away from it and go spend 3/4 of the year worrying about the desert or a jungle someplace and then come back and then do a little bit of Arctic. The equipment, the production of water, for example, those are one of a kind things that can only be done in the Arctic way. And the Russians found out that you just got to bed down and make it permanent. We have no bed down. We have no permanence up there. We don't know what we don't know in this particular area. And I'd say that that the idea that Joe brought up to reinstate some sort of relationship with the Russians, we don't want to look like we're going to militarize the Arctic. What we want to do is be cooperative in the missions that are non-military. But we have to have a capability. But at the same time, we can include the Russians in because they've got the same problems that we're going to have with those routes opening up for commercial ships. I would say there's a couple of interesting things on the horizon. The communications, DARPA's got a really interesting program where they launch a massive quantity of CubeSats and form a system of communications. And these little CubeSats can be taken out 1, 2, 3, or 4 at a time, but they simply repair themselves by alternating the data through the rest of the CubeSats. Where best to launch from than from Kodiak, where you get a direct shot at a polar orbit instead of trying to trade off fuel for weight coming out of the West Coast. Recently, the East Coast demonstrated a capability to go polar, but they paid for that in fuel. And then the JPark, as I said before, is really a place where you can offload a ship at the port of Anchorage, put them on a rail, take them into the middle of JPark, drop them off on the range, and let them disperse and get them in and out pretty fast. A short rail extension down into the JPark where the live fire range is and so on would be a real plus in terms of what we need to do in the future for preparing ourselves for Arctic missions. Getting as far away from simulation as we can, particularly in the communications area, and rehearsing, not just simulating. And I'll stop there before I choke to death.
General Gamble, simply outstanding, sir. Thank you, first of all, for the reflections back of what 40 years looked like, the problems you've dealt with 40 years that really took 10 years to make the transition from really the efforts of a Cold War in the Southeast Asia view to really how to operate in Southwest Asia. And the perspectives of what you've described there really it was not only thinking through the strategy, but it's also thinking about the organizational structure, the kind of work that you had to do to rehearse and in order to prepare for the actual operations. Applying this to an Arctic today, thinking about strategically how to logistically support the response and then logistically support the responders. Those two aspects you hit on, I think, in great detail. And absolutely, when it comes to implementation, simulation goes a long way. So you can think through some of the big problems, but leveraging the aspects of, if you're going to really achieve operational proficiency, you have to rehearse. And utilizing the resources that are here in Alaska is one great example. The training ranges here, the JPark, is truly a gem for the nation, allows us for the joint force. And you hit on this quite well, the aspect that this is, the strategy, of course, is focused on the Department of the Air Force, which is U.S. Air Force, and also the U.S. Space Force as part of the overall joint team. And Arctic operations has to be a joint endeavor for certain. The environmental impacts, absolutely large scale. Everything you have to haul in, have to haul back out, and the environmental aspects in the Arctic, one of the most pristine places on the planet, had to be preserved to the maximum extent and not imposing that. And certainly when we think about maritime operations that are out over the water, thinking about how many Alaska natives leverage the Arctic Ocean spaces essentially as their garden. So impacts of sustainability really are important to consider and to mitigate and minimize for certain. Finding ways to work in a way that, like the U.S. Coast Guard has the ability to work with their Russian counterparts, and finding a way to reestablish aspects that we can jointly work with the Russians in the right context, in the right manners, I think is really important to highlight. So thank you. I've just tried to capture some of the highlights there. Exceptional rundown. I ultimately, you just highlighted, as what General Ralston hit on earlier, strategy is the opening bell. Essentially ways, ends, and means, and now really how to think through the ways, ends, and means, the way that helps the Department of the Air Force think through this as part of the overall joint team. Let me give the floor back, and thank you for that, General Gamble. Let me give the floor back to Mike Shrega for his onward efforts. Mike?
Thanks, Church, and thank you, General Gamble. As Church noted, there's a lot there, Pat, so thank you very, very much. And that builds certainly on General Ralston's comments. One note before we move forward, different component of what you mentioned about things we worry about. One of the things we worry about is the miscommunication between military activities and civil activities in the Arctic. And we just saw this play out this summer with a significant Russian exercise in the Bering Sea, legally more than 12 miles off the coast of Alaska. but a run-in with the pollock fishermen who had every legal right to be at least 200 miles off the coast of Alaska fishing. And there was, not conflict, but there was a point in time when both the Navy fleet of the Russian Federation and fishermen from the state of Alaska and elsewhere in the same location, some reports of harassment, but nevertheless, this is this emerging Arctic now where we do see the potential for a flare up, maybe well-meaning intent on the fishermen, a naval exercise, and communications challenges. So we do see this in real time, which is what many of us worry about. I wanted to focus on that because that is not a future scenario. It actually has happened, and that's worth further investigation as well. Now it's time to transition to General Chandler, the former Vice Chief of Staff for the United States Air Force. General Chandler, over to you, and thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you to Church as well for for inviting me. It's another bright and shiny day in Big Lake, Alaska, and fall is here for sure. I'd simply like to add to what Joe and Pat have said. There's not much that I can add other than to say that I am cautiously optimistic about what I see going on with the Air Force in Alaska, as well as the actual strategy itself. We have a very comprehensive national security strategy that we're able to nest a DoD Arctic strategy in. I think that gives a lot of foundation for what's gone on in terms of the Department of Defense Arctic strategy, with three very clear objectives that the Air Force, I think, did a good job of piggybacking on with its strategy, with its own strategy. Having said that, if you look at the history of where the Army Air Corps has been and where the Air Force has been in the Arctic, the strategy simply helps build on the infrastructure that has been established, at least here in the state of Alaska, as well as in Greenland, and points out the foundation, I think, that we have to build on. And I think the foundation is a good one. The strategy itself describes the 79% of the resources being placed here in the Arctic by the Department of Defense belong to the Air Force. And that, in fact, has been in large part some foresight for the leadership that occurred well before me, of course, in the Air Force. But when you look at the posturing of AWACS and F-15s at the time, we thought that was fairly revolutionary. If you fast forward to today with the F-22 and the F-35, the improvements to the missile defense system and the space warning systems that the Space Force is working on at places like Clear and Erickson, as well as Thule. And then, as Joe mentioned, the possibility to bring the KC-46 here, as well as the JPARC, which allows us to bring it all together. And now, as the former chief and the current chief have emphasized, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control that knits that all together and builds the roads that allow us to be able to provide the command and control that we've talked about here. So there's a lot of good underlying things that go on in the strategy itself, but I think I would simply echo the point that's been made that geography matters, and there are resource requirements that need to be placed here in the Pacific. A lot of the infrastructure that Joe Crum is working on today was Cold War infrastructure, although some of that has been improved. And frankly, when I was the vice chief, it was very difficult to explain at times to the air staff some of the things that Joe pointed out with regard to the geography. These are the most expensive bases in the Air Force when you come at looking at trying to maintain Elmendorf and Eielson, and that comes into play at budget time. But we have to remember that our competitors are going to get a full vote in that, and the geography hasn't changed since the time of Billy Mitchell and Hap Arnold. So those investments are something that we're going to need to keep an eye on and not let get drowned out in the noise that will be the future budget debates. As was pointed out earlier, and I think is very important, this is a whole of DoD opportunity, if you will. Not just the services in the Department of Defense, but all the applicable agencies, and that includes the state of Alaska. They have a large play in what goes on here, particularly in terms of things like warm water ports in Nome and other aviation-related things or naval-related things that go on around the state. Private industry, particularly petroleum, plays a large part in the area that we're talking about, as well as native corporations. And then, of course, I think the strategy does a good job of pointing out that indigenous people in the state of Alaska have been here since the beginning of time and probably know more about this area that we can certainly learn. So I think the strategy did a good job of touching on all those things. And again, I'm optimistic with regard to the strategy itself. I think the jury's still out on the resources that we need to back that strategy up. But in the short term, I think we have a foundation that's been laid by leadership in the past that would certainly allow us to build on if we take that seriously and push forward from here. That's all I'd like to say, unless you have questions for me later. Thanks.
Thank you, General. We certainly do have questions. I want to thank everyone who is sending questions in. It's a robust list on my screen at the moment. But General, you noted a couple of things maybe we'll come back to. One is the knitting together of the various strategies within DoD. We've heard this a number of times about some kind of coordinating effort within the services to leverage the needs and the assets and the resources. Comms has come up a number of times. The strategic position of Alaska certainly has not changed, and it's good to see that we're building upon that. You noted a number of points, but to me, when you talked about knitting together the different strategies, to me as a geographer, I went right to the map. And so in my map, I was thinking about your comments and perspectives, and maybe we'll come back to this, everything from this line between the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, into the Pacific, into the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait, right up into the Arctic. To me, this one narrative all the way up in the way in which Alaska is situated, and the very strategy of the Air Force and how that fits into some kind of strategy beyond the Arctic, how it looks at all of our assets while we watch North Korea, certainly Russian activities, and then down into the Pacific as well. So maybe we'll loop back into that as well. You mentioned Greenland and Thule. We'll loop back into that because I have a number of questions on that as well. So thank you for building upon that and situating the state of Alaska in that context. Church, I'll just turn it right back to you, my friend.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. Let me just now queue up our next speaker, the former commander of the United States Southern Command, General Douglas Fraser. General Fraser, of course, prior to his service in leading Southern Command, was also in Alaska, NORAD region, Alaska Command, 11th Air Force commander up here. We were trying to entice him to come back to stay, maybe stay a bit chilly for him to hang out for a year round, or perhaps for his bride. But we do hope that we can get you to come back sometime, General Fraser. And sir, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thanks, Church, and thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as General Chandler said, everything's almost been said. So I'm gonna add some emphasis to some places and maybe add some other parts to it. I think where I'd like to start first is really looking at the Space Force. We talked about the Department of the Air Force strategy. A lot of our experience has been focused within the Air Force. The Space Force also plays a very important role in Alaska and the Arctic. And I would argue that for not only the United States, but probably globally, if you look at space and polar orbits, they're becoming much more important to the world, especially as you look at communications capabilities with a lot of companies such as Starlink and OneWeb starting to populate some pretty significant constellations in low Earth orbit. The Space Force has good capability in the Arctic, as General Chandler mentioned, with radars there in Alaska and also in Greenland and in the UK. There are satellite command and control facilities in the Arctic that are important also. I think the thing that I look at as we move forward is, and General Chandler, General Gamble brought this up, we are still, I would argue, living off of infrastructure that was built during the Cold War. And we haven't really changed much from that infrastructure. We've modernized capabilities within those locations, but we haven't really broadened beyond that. And I think one of the challenges for this strategy is really truly looking at the resource implications of the strategy for what it means for Alaska. specifically, but I'll talk here in a minute with what it means more broadly internationally. We haven't done that to the way I think we ought to. That applies from a space capability. It applies as more commercial industry comes in and starts looking at space. But I'd also argue it applies from a cyber standpoint and the backbones that support all the cyber capability, but a lot of the other capabilities. General Ralston brought up the fact that we need to look at not only space infrastructure, but terrestrial infrastructure as the strategy moves forward. I think, and I think both General Gamble and General Chandler brought this up, it also brings up the issue of logistics. And Alaska does have a logistics challenge, I would argue. There are limited capabilities if you really want to push a lot of capability into Alaska. And it's one of those areas that I think we need to continue to pay attention to. But the Space Force is not only located in Alaska, it has capabilities, as we mentioned, in other parts of the region. And the Arctic is more than just Alaska, as everybody knows. And the advantages that Alaska provides from a geostrategic standpoint, Russia has some of those same geostrategic advantages with access to the polar regions. And I think we need to just keep that in mind. So from my aspect, both as you look internationally, you look at NORAD with the binational command of the United States and Canada, and then link that into NATO. I think there's much more work that can be done and needs to be done as you look beyond Alaska into those two organizations, if you will, that I don't think have traditionally really linked as closely as we might have them do. And I think there are good opportunities for improving those relationships. And maybe as you look at the strategy, what does that mean on an international basis as far as building all the capabilities and requirements that will be required to support the Arctic strategy? And finally, Mike brought this up, but I think going back to Alaska, the importance of the approaches to the Arctic are going to be significant, and they're going to play a bigger role. From a specific Alaska standpoint, I think that means as Mike talked about, the Aleutian Islands and that chain, the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait. But I think we ought to pay a lot of attention to the Aleutians. I think because they provide really a string across the approaches into the Bering. And as more and more strategic activity happens within the Bering and through the northern approaches, the Aleutians are going to be strategic and key terrain. And that's going to present its own challenges as we move forward. But I think that's an area that we really need to pay attention to. And the Air Force and Space Force will be key contributors into addressing the issues that we see out there. And so those are my thoughts as we look at the strategy. And I'm really pleased to have had the opportunity to join my partners in crime here, although most of them I think I worked with more than or worked for, let me put it that way, than worked with. So it's really is a pleasure to be back with you. And that's all I have. Look forward to the questions.
General Fraser, thank you very much, sir. Outstanding reflection. I appreciate you taking time to dwell on the Space Force part of this conversation, highlighting that obviously for the radars, for the early warning, satellite communications, modernizing the current infrastructure. It's always a challenge, especially it costs 4 times just the cost of logistically getting the materials up to this region, and what it means for Alaska, but also what it means for the greater Pan-Arctic. Looking at cyber, I think that's an important aspect crosses multiple dimensions of concern. NORAD and obviously the binational relationship of North American security and defense vantage point, I think is critical. there's some elements that I think within the national relationship between Washington and Ottawa that could use some rebolstering, and certainly know the Tri-Command framework between NORAD, U.S. Northcom, and Canadian Joint Operations Command is critical. Growing that partnership more closely, I think, is really important. The approaches, you're right, as Rain, it does matter. And it's interesting you highlighted the aspects on the approach when you think about the Aleutians. U.S. Coast Guard District 17 Commander Rear Admiral Matt Bell concerns himself a lot about the Aleutians because that's all along the pathway between Great Circle communications from the western part of North America, between West Coast US, West Coast of Canada, and Asian markets in the Far East. So I think the Aleutians, of course, is one aspect of a key terrain in that string across the string of islands that cross that really separate the North Pacific from the Bering, is an area that is key terrain. So I appreciate you highlighting all those elements, sir. I'm hoping that by highlighting them briefly will help cue the conversation for the onward question that we need to get to over soon. But thank you very much for that, sir. Mike, let me give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Church. We're close to the end of the formal presentations, so I'm going to leave some of the questions to loop back around to after this, but it's fitting that we've talked a little bit about the NATO alliance, NORAD, and our partners in the neighborhood. And I want to come back to that again in relation to Greenland and recent activities and decisions by NATO for the Arctic on a joint command with the Danish military. So it's probably a really great segue into our next speaker, General Philip Breedlove, former commander of the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe in NATO. General, I want to thank you very much for joining us. There's a lot to unpack already by your colleagues, but perhaps your perspective at the end of this might be to maybe weave some of these themes together, but in particular, just following up on that one particular note about weaving the efforts between the United States, NATO, and possibly links into Greenland, knowing your former position within NATO. So thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I think you and Church, Mike, owe me a beer trying to do bat cleanup behind my former mentors and friends here. So it's going to be a little bit tough. I do want to talk and try to focus on the fact that we are a part of a joint team. And as several of our speakers have mentioned, this Air Force strategy does well as it nestles under our national defense strategy and national security strategy. And I would also say, as you have alluded, it mates well to where NATO is headed as it wakes up to the concerns of the North. I'd like to just hit 2 or 3 things, though, that the Air Force uniquely brings to that joint team, and our preceding speakers have really hit them already. Our position in Alaska, our position in the North, and the reach that it gives us. And reach means a lot of things. Reach in surveillance, reach in fighter defense forces as a part of NORAD, reach and lift, and all the other things that we bring to that joint team need to be emphasized. And as General Ralston laid out so eloquently, our ability to respond as a part of that joint team from those northern bases really puts us in a position not dominated by the fact that we have so much assets out there, but what we can do for that more joint team. Second thing I'd like to say is I still look at the high north as an opportunity. We often talk of it in terms of a challenge as if it was a military problem to solve. But we need to think of it in terms of an opportunity. And how do we reach out to the Russians? And even, yes, the Chinese who want to be a part of the high north. We've got to figure out how to make this go forward in the future. So what I'd like to do very quickly and then get off the stage is talk a little bit about Russia and China as it relates to our 4 lines of effort from our strategy. Vigilance. We have to keep our eyes out there, as was talked about. We have a place and placeholders in this vigilance game, but improving it, as General Ralston spoke to, our ability to upgrade and meet the more challenging things that Russia is putting on the plate and China will begin to bring to this area. And our ability to keep that constance there, not only in space and in the air, but helping our surface brothers keep up with what's going on in that growing water structure that we talk so much about. Power projection don't need to cover it anymore, except for that our nation needs to remember, as General Chandler mentioned, that this is not a cheap or easy thing to do in the high north, and that we need to keep our eyes focused on that we have some really amazing assets there. But if we don't do the hard work of making them work in this tough environment and providing them the logistics, as General Fraser mentioned, then we will have an empty capability in the north. As I mentioned, cooperation. Yes, I like to say that Russia is practicing sovereignty by presence. Russia is practicing sovereignty by presence. We're going to have to cooperate with them. They're already there. They've improved land, air, and sea capability in the north. They see that northern passage opening up and they want to be able to dominate that passage. And really, we haven't challenged them there yet, but China has, as they've sailed through these spaces and took their icebreaker up there and done their own freedom of navigation. So we need to get our foot in the door and establish our presence such that we can cooperate, as we talk about in the third line LOE. And then finally, preparation. As I was leaving my time as the SACUR, we were looking at or just after I left as SACUR, we were looking at a Marine exercise in the north. And they went up there to establish a battalion-sized command and control capability. And they couldn't get a shot to a military satellite to establish the minimum amount of bandwidth to be able to run their battalion TOC. And we asked a commercial venture to come up there and use one of their antennas to hook to their satellite capability. And that's what it took. None of our military could solve the problem, but it took a commercial venture to establish enough bandwidth to run the battalion command and control. That's just one battalion. Think about the scale that was mentioned before. We're not at scale in that way. And so we have a lot of preparation to do. That same Marine exercise that went up there found that our cold weather gear was quite out of date. And we needed to refit and refurbish in cold weather gear in order to be able to do the missions that we talk about in the north. So as we look at the challenges of a Russia practicing sovereignty by presence, as we look at the challenges and opportunities of a China that is establishing itself in the space, we have to think about how we in those four lines of effort are going to respond. And then finally, as I think about the big joint picture and how maybe we should congratulate ourselves a little bit that we are moving well into this problem set, but we're far short. And I just want to bring up two things in a joint sense. We're far short. How many icebreakers do we have that can operate in these spaces? I used to say one, and now I understand it's having problems. Okay. And what are our competitors doing in those spaces? And secondarily, just as I mentioned before, polar comms. We have commercial entities that are beginning to crawl into these spaces. And maybe that's the way that we should go, partnering with commercial entities. But have we really worked the problem? Is it right and appropriate that a Marine battalion cannot connect to a military communications capability for the high north? I don't think so. So I'm going to get off the stage with that. I think that the wiser men before me have covered all the meat. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, General Breedlove, thank you very much for those comments. I think, in fact, you did weave many of the themes together quite well, but you also added to the discussions and foundationally teased out a couple of matters that I'd like to transition to now. I've been watching emails coming through, and I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of them because there is an incredible amount of questions coming in. But Church, if you don't mind, I want to start with a question for the panel, and anyone take a shot at this, or several of you, and then Church, I'll lead it over to you for a question. But it's striking. A number of issues are striking here. One is that you each have given us input and perspective into the Air Force's strategy. You have each talked about ways in which we might be able to move forward that strategy. You've put it in context of Alaska, the United States, the North American Arctic, and work with our allies throughout the North. You've given it, you've underlined and underscored the need to resource this effort. It's only good, strategy is only good if it gets some resources. You've given it context historically. You've kind of given a window into what tomorrow could and should look like for the North American Arctic, the Arctic, and the U.S. interest in the Arctic and vis-a-vis DoD. But a question, it's been interesting to listen to many of you who have said that it is important to engage with the Russian Federation, cooperation, training, operations, on and on. I'll preface this very long question. I have used a game analogy when people have asked, what is China thinking? What is Russia thinking? And what is the United States thinking when it comes to the Arctic and these particular issues? And to me, I've used a game analogy, not pejorative. And in a nutshell, and I'd like your response to this, in a nutshell, it has been, when you think about Russia and their interest in the Arctic, they play the game survivor. And I don't mean that in a pejorative manner. As we've noted, a lot of their GDP and exports come through the Arctic, and they have a semi-closed economic structure, certainly a different political structure. But in a growing time of uncertainty in the globe, they're playing the game survivor. China plays the game go, right? Long-term strategies, economic influence, on and on and on. And again, not pejorative. The United States plays the game twister. We are literally everywhere, as I think we should be as the United States. So my question to all of you is, how do we balance this? How do we resource an Air Force strategy and all the other services strategy? And how do we move forward with all of our other concerns globally to put a spotlight on the Arctic and how strategic it is to the United States? And perhaps I would ask maybe General Ralston to begin that, respond to that. And you can say, sir, that I'm off mark, but I would like your input into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. No, I don't think you're off the mark at all. And my initial reaction is we are all over the globe. We do have global responsibilities. But if you look at the National Defense Strategy, I think we have come to a somewhat of an agreement. This is something that both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have agreed upon, is that the Indo-Pacific is important. And again, if you look at the geography of Alaska, we are key players in the Indo-Pacific arena. And that's something that I think needs to be pounded on inside Washington, D.C. As you look into the Indo-Pacific and you try to disperse your bases. Okay, I agree with that, but don't forget that Alaska is a part of that.
Mike, if I
Thank you.
could,
Please.
just to add to that, I think that our nation has to make some decisions. What I saw in my latter years as the SACUR is Europe recognizing how important the Northern Passage was. For a slow ship, it saves 14 days. For different kinds of ship, it's different kinds of days in transit from the ports of Northern Europe to the Asian ports. And if you just think about the money saving, the frequency of the use of the hulls, et cetera, this is a big deal. So Russia, or excuse me, NATO and others are taking this very seriously because they see it as a big economic issue to them. And so I think one of the things we need to do in the United States is make big decisions about, is the Arctic important? And do we see a future for American transit and other things there? And then I think the priorities of these things may rise a little bit. We might actually decide to build an icebreaker. Over.
Thank you, General. Let me ask if any other members of the panel would like to speak to that particular issue? And if not, I'll turn it back over to Church, and then we'll visit some of the questions coming from online.
Hey, Mike, let me just add one thing, and I think it goes to what both General Breedlove and General Ralston said, and we've always and all talked about the strategic location of Alaska. And that's a strategic location not only for North America, but on a global basis. And that's what we've all been talking about. So I think what we're all recognizing is it's time to leverage the strategic location of Alaska and not put it off to the side.
Thank you, General. Church, over to you.
Okay, I have a question that was relayed to me from the chat people who manage all this, so I am not seeing all the other elements, but I'll queue up the one that I see right here. The questions come in and says, following up on General Ralston's recommendation to restart the 1993 United States and Russian Federation search and rescue exercise of military forces, in addition, of course, to Coast Guard units. Would any of you care to please share from your vantage point how such an exercise could enhance stability and security in the Arctic, despite continuing tension with Russia in the overall strategic relationship between both our nations? The floor is open for further reflections as any of you would like to maybe take a bite at that apple.
Yeah, Church, if you don't mind, I'll take that one on. I had the opportunity to participate in one of those exercises. And while the Coast Guard commander, I think, was a little bit frustrated because of the cuffs that were put on him by their central military, he was very amenable to what we were doing and was actually very helpful. And what I found was the Coast Guard had a very good relationship there. Now, the Navy admiral that was sent to oversee the exercise made it very clear that he wasn't necessarily there to have a good time, and he wasn't necessarily there to help forward the objectives of the exercise. So there was an undercurrent, frankly, of not really enjoying working with the Americans. But I would tell you, at the same time, at the grassroots level, on up through some of the Coast Guard leadership, we had a very, very good exercise that allowed a lot of cross play back and forth. And this particular exercise took place in Russia, by the way, at the time. I agree with General Ralston. It's sort of a baby steps kind of approach to what we're trying to do, but at the same time, it opens up a venue for us to communicate, which is going to become, I think, more and more important as we go forward based on all the things that we've talked about in the past. I don't know if Joe Crum wants to take that one on or not, but I would tell you that it's something at least worthwhile exploring. Over.
George Heller, thank you. Joe Crum, would you care to comment?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, sir. I think it's something we are looking at. I've actually spoken with John Ralston about this previously. And I think what we have to remember is we're here to deter, and doing that means that you have a mutual understanding, you have lines of communication, and those things are exercised and practiced before crisis. And when that comes, we don't want misunderstandings occurring when there's something that happens in the Arctic. We want those pathways to have been traveled before between our two countries so that we can communicate and avoid those misunderstandings. So I think it's very important. I think we're going to look at it. I think that the exercises that General Ralston began back in the early 90s are a great foundation that we can build upon. And I'm excited about looking forward to that. And I think the opportunities are going to be there for a long time for us to do this together. Over.
Mike, if I could just add one point. The overall strategic situation between the U.S. and Russia is complicated. I understand that. But today, as I understand it, we have direct military to military communications in the Middle East, in Syria, et cetera, so that things can be de-escalated if they need to be, and use that as a precedent for trying to establish communications between us and the Russians in the Arctic. I think makes a lot of sense. And again, it can be done in a non-threatening way. It's search and rescue. Somebody goes down in the Arctic. It doesn't matter whether it's in Alaska or Siberia. We're going to need help when we do that. And so I think that's a point I'd like to put on the table.
Outstanding, General. Heartily agree. Are there any other reflections on this? Mike, let me give the floor back to you.
Thank you. Church, I'm going through the questions and I'm trying to condense about, as far as I can tell, about 13 different questions into something that makes some sense here. So open it up to the panel. There's a lot of discussion about the other side of the world from where I sit here in Fairbanks, which is the GI-UK gap and the strategic location of Greenland vis-a-vis strategic location of Alaska and the North American Arctic. So let me try to sum this up. Looking for your perspectives and insight about the recent announcement by NATO, NATO's Maritime Command, MARCOM. They've established a new operational coordination arrangement with the Danish Joint Arctic Command in Greenland, happened just on the 1st. And your thoughts about the activities within the sort of European Arctic, the Scandinavian Arctic, but for the United States, the sort of renaissance in interest activities of the GI-UK gap and what the United States Air Force can do to be a part of the solution set with NATO in terms of not just space-based and Air Force projection, but being visible via the surface so that it is known to others that the United States does take the NATO alliance seriously, the transatlantic alliance seriously, and there's a point of presence, several points of presence, but also that we are prepared for something that perhaps isn't here today, but might be tomorrow on that side of the world in terms of much more activity from the Russian Federation and how NATO is responding to that. So I've condensed about 13 different questions. The bottom line is, with this Air Force strategy, how does it fit into taking care of and overseeing and taking into consideration the increased activity in the GI-UK gap off the coast of Norway and Russian activities, including the Baltic? That's a long and that's a lot. I understand that, but I'd open it up to the panel and any one of those issues.
So for about almost 3 decades, we've been trying to hug the bear. We've been trying to bring Russia into a larger Western community of values and ways of doing business. In that 3 decades, they've invaded Georgia in 2008. And then in the spring of 14, they invaded Crimea. And then later in 14, they invaded the Donbass. And now they're power projecting into places like Libya, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we've learned is that the bear is not really right now excited about being hugged. The bear is excited about expanding itself into spaces that the Western world have given up as far as leadership in some of these areas. During those 3 decades, we accepted that we would have free and clear transit of the Atlantic if we needed to reinforce Europe, or to move to the Middle East, or to take some of the paths to the Far East and the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And what we now know is that that is not permissive space, and that we once again are going to have to earn our way across the Atlantic. And the capabilities that come out of the Bastion waters, and frankly have fooled us a couple of times now and shadowed our carrier battle groups all the way through into the Med, at least one case. They're very capable, and now they have demonstrated and shown us that they can be there when they want to be there, and that they can disrupt our transit if they want to disrupt our transit. And that changes a lot of paradigms about how we think. Do we have enough ro-ros? We've seen our commercial fleet go down. We've seen the craft air fleet go down, and all of our throughput is challenged and not really to task if we have to fight our way across the Atlantic. And these GI-UK gap areas where we used to have some very exquisite capabilities to keep up with things, those have all gone fallow and need reinvestment, as several of our speakers have talked about investment in Alaska and other places today. And so this is, Alaska is a huge part of what we need to do, but we also have to put some emphasis and some investment and logistics against knowing and understanding and characterizing the threat that comes out of the Bastion waters through the GI-UK threat.
Let me ask other panelists if they have thoughts on that particular issue.
This is Doug Fraser. I'm gonna switch it a little bit and remind everybody the importance of the Atlantic. And I agree completely with what General Breedlove said. But I think it's also important that we recognize that both the Northwest Passage and the Northern Passage all link through one strategic waterway in the West. And that's through the Bering Strait, the Bering Sea into the Pacific. And so the issues that we're facing and talking about in the GI-UK gap, we need to be very cognizant that they could also appear in the Bering Sea.
Thank you. Church, back over to you. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Well, at this point, thank you, Mike, and generals, thank you for that. General Breedlove, I just loved the remark about hugging the bear and how much the bear likes to be hugged. And that's just falls back to some great perspectives you had in leading United States European Command during time together at the time. Unfortunately, the sands to the hourglass are going way too fast for us, as it always is the case. So in the last few minutes, I'd just like to give the opportunity for some closing reflections from each of you, and then give it back to Mike to finish it. First, let me go to General Ralston for your reflections, your key takeaways that you'd like to leave us with today, sir.
No, just to paraphrase something that we used to say at NATO and everybody's heard, that everything has been said that could possibly be said about this subject, but not yet by everyone. So I think that applies to this morning. Thank you all very much. It's good to be with you.
General, thank you. Mike, back to you.
Well, let me just ask if there's other following comments. We've got a couple of minutes left from other panelists.
I'll just say I'm really damn proud of our United States Air Force. I think this is good work. I think we are showing a lot of leadership in Alaska and in the high north. I think we can step up and reestablish some leadership in this thought process in NATO and Europe. And this document is a great start, but better than the document is the attitude and the people and the equipment that we've got up there doing this business. And God bless and keep them all.
Amen. General Breedlove, thank you. Let me go to General Gamble for reflections from you, sir.
Thanks, Church. In the past, when we've responded big time to international events, there's usually been a trigger event that finally got us off the dime. And in the military sense, we went into the Middle East and so on. There's a triggering event. I would hope that there are no military triggering events in the Arctic. And as we set up the flow and the path through the Arctic for the economics that will grow, certainly Russia has a historical concern for its borders, and its military districts were constructed in order to be able to fight at each of the major areas in its borders. And so that's not unusual to see it go into the Arctic and settle down, much like it has in other places over its history when it was the Soviet military. The Russians aren't much different in terms of their thinking as they settle down in the Arctic. The triggering event, though, I would hope would be our combined response to be able to go into a cruise ship or to some kind of ecological disaster, a leaking tanker, something like that, where because of the relationship we've built with them that was suggested that we've been successful in doing before, in Alaska particularly, we are able to go in side by side, talk to each other, coordinate with each other, because we've been thinking and doing more and more to prepare for that eventuality rather than a military eventuality. I think we can get our allies and partners more on board with that kind of thinking. I think if we go in there acting like we're trying to set up a military organization in the Arctic, a lot of our friends are going to say, I don't have national vital interests up there and I can't afford it anyway. So I'm out of here. And once again, we'll be stuck by ourselves. We don't want that path. And as a result, as we look at what everybody's recommending that we do, I think the Air Force strategy supports that entirely without being military to the extent that it causes concern in other people's camps.
General Gamble, thank you very much, sir, for that outstanding set of reflections. General Chandler, let me give the floor to you, sir.
Thank you, Church, and thank you, Mike, as well, for the opportunity to participate. I would also say, as we look at the resource requirements behind the strategy, and while I'm optimistic about the strategy itself, regardless of where the political winds go here in the next few months, we may well have seen a high watermark in Department of Defense budgets here for at least the foreseeable future. So it's going to be a fairly daunting task to be able to try to prioritize all of these things to actually fund a strategy that's going to be meaningful in the Arctic. But I think it's an imperative that we in fact work on. And then I would simply close by saying, when I was the ALCOM commander, I used to look out across the audience and you'd see this guy named Ralston and this guy named Gamble sitting at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon. And I always was reminded that I was the third, probably best ever ALCOM commander that there ever was. So it's a little bit distressing for me to be back in that environment. But at the same time, I think I can look over my shoulder and see that there are a few guys that followed me over.
General Chandler, that's simply outstanding. Thank you. Let me go to General Fraser for comments for you, sir.
Well, let me echo what General Chandler just said. I had to follow all three, and so it's always good to have help when you're in positions, and I say that approvingly. But I think, like General Breedlove said, I agree with. I'm proud of the Air Force for stepping up, and I know that from my time in Alaska, they have a willing partner in the Alaskans to help support whatever's required to support the strategy into the future. So it's been a pleasure working with all my mentors and partners, and look forward to a future opportunity.
General Fraser, thank you so very much, sir. Much appreciated. General Crum, you've got the watch. Any reflection from your vantage point, sir?
Well, I tell John Chandler, there's a lot of looking up from this, the guys that have gone before me. So I really do appreciate it. I think that this is a new chapter for us. Where we've gone as a nation and the priorities that we've made. We've recognized the national defense strategy that protection of the homeland homeland defense is number one. And I think that that's safeguarding our interest in a security manner, but it's also economic and environmental. And I think when we look to the Arctic, we know we have to build the infrastructure and the sustainment that we need. A lot of the things we do right now are temporal in nature. We can power project, but we can't necessarily be there for a sustained period of time. And I think that that's the key going forward. And I look forward to the discussions that we have in the future. Over.
General Crum, thank you very much, sir. You truly are standing on the shoulder of giants, in fact, perhaps of the Titan class. And I appreciate the graciousness in which you command the team. And I will look forward to working and serving with you as you continue to help advance efforts of security and defense for the Arctic in your current role as Alaska Command 11th Air Force and Alaska NORAD Region Commander. Let me turn the floor back to my cohort and partner in this Arctic Security Dialogues endeavor, Dr. Shrega. Mike, sir, over to you, sir, for any further remarks and closing reflections.
Well, Church, first let me thank you and the team at ADAC for partnering with us. On behalf of all our colleagues here at the Wilson Center, I want to thank you. This Arctic Security Dialogue series will continue. I don't know how we beat this. The bar is way high. It has fulfilled every wish I think Church and I have had for a roundtable discussion with such a distinguished group of leaders. It's important that we have perspective on not just the Air Force strategy, but going forward, all things Arctic. I would hope that this distinguished panel would not mind us being back in touch with all of you to follow up and perhaps craft some other related discussions. I trust, General Crum, that this discussion has also been helpful to you and your team as you consider not only the Air Force's strategy, but the role here in Alaska and thinking of it in a larger context as you do for a living. But we're hopeful that this has value on multiple levels for the rest of the United States to understand the Arctic is important to this country, to our allies who would understand what our strategies are and we're here for the long term. And also, as we try to navigate this new Arctic, all the complexities that General Ralston started out with, but also that were reiterated over and over again. This is not just about DoD in the Arctic. This is about our Arctic, the US in the Arctic, in all its components. And so you will see from Church and I follow-up discussions on the civil security side as well. We have search and rescue issues, have homeland security issues, on and on and on. So this series will be much broader, but the perspective here on this first one is not only appreciated, but I think important, and a very important way to start this day. So Church, I want to thank you and your team, to this distinguished panel of leaders. I want to thank you for your service to this country, and thank you for your insights. And to General Crum, good luck. And you always can call upon ADAC and the Wilson Center in any way that we can help move the narrative forward. And to our friends watching out there, thank you to the hundreds who are watching and the many questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to them. And please look forward to the next announcement of our next series, which will be later on this year. So to everyone watching, and again, to this distinguished panel, I want to thank you. And we look forward to the very next one. And have a good rest of the morning, afternoon, and evening, no matter where you are. Thank you again. And thank you to the Wilson team for your support.